Delighted to welcome Richard Cohen this evening to talk about his great uncle, Sir Jack Cohen. Just a little bit of background on Richard. Richard was a barrister called to the bar in 1977 under pupil master Lord Brian Keith, who by coincidence was a school friend of mine at UCS, who was a judge later on in Hong Kong. 3 years later, he was appointed assistant company secretary of BJAM, which is now Iceland, who were clients of mine again, and then doubly qualified as a solicitor, practicing, I think, until last year. His outside interests include former district councillor for Epping, former Rotarian, councillor on Christian and Jews, has been on the board of deputies since 2002, and a former chairman and senior warden of Loughton Synagogue. He's also interested in amateur dramatics. And last but not least, chair of the Jewish Historical Society of England, Essex branch. He researched and proofread Andrew Roberts' new biography of Winston Churchill, interviewing the author of JW3 on publication as well, like we with King Richard III. Richard's also delivered some 20 other lectures on the subject in the UK, Spain, Israel, and at Lemud, as well as on his great uncle Jack Cohen of Tesco, who he'll be talking to us about this evening. After Richard's finished, he's kindly said that he will take some question and answers. So if you can put those up on your chat line, and then I'll be able to come to you and pose them. So over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that extremely warm welcome. I moved house about 6 months ago, and it's amazing, isn't it, what you find when you do move house, because I found a photograph there, which of course is very apposite in view of the recent demise of the Duke of Edinburgh. This photograph would have been around the time when Jack was knighted back in the late 1970s. I don't know how Prince Philip managed to break his arm, but he looks pretty cheerful nevertheless. On the right here, you can see Lady Sarah Cohen, also known as Sissy. I don't know who the lady in the middle is, nor the other lady. So if anybody can guess, do let me know. Now, as we're still admitting people, I'm going to take this opportunity of showing a short film. So let me just, here we are. If any one of you has seen this film, then I apologize in advance, but it's only about 6 minutes. It just gives you a little bit of a flavor of the man. So here we go.
I'm not getting any sound.
You're not hearing any sound? Wow. Okay. All right, I'll have to move on. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't realize you couldn't get the sound. So there is a photograph of Jack, also known as Sir John Edward Cohen. The reason why he changed his name from Jack to Sir John was not just because he wanted to be a member of the establishment, as it were, but where he opened his bank account at Midland Bank in Mare Street, there were so many clients of the bank that were called Jack Cohen that the manager suggested that he change his name. So hence the reason for Sir John. So why am I showing a picture of Napoleon? Well, as you probably remember from your history lessons at school, Napoleon said that the English, not the British, but the English were a nation of shopkeepers. I've never quite worked out why that was regarded as an insult, because in some respects, I think it's very honourable, as George Canning, the Foreign Secretary and one-time Prime Minister, replied to Napoleon through the French ambassador: "Be yours the glory of a victory followed by disaster and ruin. Be ours the inglorious traffic of industry and an ever-increasing prosperity." George Canning was probably the shortest lasting prime minister. He died after about 3 months, so that crown does not in fact fall to Theresa May. So what was life like? Tesco's been around for 102 years now. What was life like a century ago? Well, as you know, very acute observers of the social scene around 100 years ago or so were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the latter of whom spent some time in Manchester. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of its blessings. You can see here that the boys are not wearing any shoes. This was the kind of dinner that the average working man could look forward to. Dripping and bread, staple working class diet, when, as Disraeli said, the world was for the few and the very few. There were even bed bugs 100 years ago. It's very easy for rich people to preach the virtues of self-reliance to the poor. It is also very foolish, because as a matter of fact, the wealthy, so far from being self-reliant, are dependent on the constant attention of scores and sometimes hundreds of persons who are employed in waiting upon them and ministering to their wants. Ian Maclaurin says that Jack imparted some important wisdom to him that stayed with him for the rest of his career. Remember one thing: the most humble person in an organization is the most important. Now, I must come clean with you about some of the previous remarks that I've put on the screen. They weren't, in fact, anything to do with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were all uttered by none other than Winston Churchill. Anyway, here's an example of somebody that was an employee of Tesco and remained loyal to Tesco for the whole of his career and passed that on to his family. Jack spotted the 14-year-old Jim Harrow at the Croydon market and noted his skill in obtaining the best pitch. So Jack soon had Jim running his stall, selling unlabeled tins of fruit and veg. Later, Jim became the transport manager and met Jack's other employee, Peggy, whom he married in due course. Jim's loyalty to the governor was such that he only bought from Tesco for the rest of his life and had his sons working for Tesco and named one of his daughters after Shirley Porter, née Cohen. Jim's son Colin says that Jim was very proud to work at Tesco, and Jack always looked after his parents. And Jim went on to manage the Ponders End store, was able to buy a house in Chessington for £3,000 and had a company car. My dad was working class, and he and Jack shared that experience of working their way up from market stalls to businessmen. So Jack Cohen wouldn't claim to be the best looking man in the world, but he went to a photographer called Boris Bennett, about whom we've had a talk to the Jewish Historical Society. He was the doyen of photographers in the 30s, based in East End, and you can see he smartened Jack up with the ubiquitous suit and cigarette. That's probably more of the image of what Jack looks like, a bit like a prize fighter. And the man to his right is my grandfather, Morris, who didn't go into Tesco. He worked as a tailor for most of his life. And that's Mossy Vanger on the left, who I believe is a nephew of Jack. So Boris Bennett was known as the man who brought Hollywood to the East End. And I'm sure some of you will perhaps tell us a couple of anecdotes about him afterwards. Jack had a broken nose, which, although he did serve in the army from 1917, that actually happened to him in an accident. So it wasn't through anything to do with the war. He always dressed smartly when he met his customers. This was his favorite arena. Of course, you can see the latter part of the famous slogan about him: "Pile it high and sell it cheap." He had a tremendous rapport with his customers. As you can see, they all look pretty happy there. People were much smarter in those days, generally. You know, there was a time in the 50s and 60s, even if you flew on an aeroplane or a train, you would dress up. So there is a biography of Jack Cohen. It's a bit out of date now, by Maurice Carina, called "Pile It High and Sell It Cheap." You can get it on Amazon for a couple of pounds. Now that's the Tesco family. In front of Jack is his wife, Sissy, also known as Sarah. And to our right is Shirley Porter, and to our left is Irene Kreitman. And there's Leslie Porter to Jack's right, to our right rather, and Hyman Kreitman to our left of Jack. And there's the grandchildren as well. Tesco have always advertised their brand unashamedly, and all kinds of gimmicks have been used to help promote them. And there is Jack's successor as chairman, Sir Ian Maclaurin, who also wrote a book about Tesco, which he called Catching a Tiger by the Tail. It's quite a lot of it is complimentary and some of it is critical, especially about Shirley Porter. He definitely did not want her to succeed him in the boardroom because of her lack of experience within Tesco. Of course, Tesco started humbly as a stall in Wells Street, Hackney, but it's a universal company now worldwide. In Korea, they've got their own museum to Tesco, which, as you would expect, looks pretty spick and span. There's a much smaller exhibition about Tesco at their head office in Welwyn Garden City. So this is Jack's philosophy on the type-in. I would normally ask if anybody knows what it means, but I think that would be too disruptive as we're on Zoom. He used to hand out these type-ins when he met people for the first time. Ian Maclaurin was a very keen cricketer, and when he took Jack to Lord's, Jack used to introduce himself to people that he'd never met before, saying, "I'm Jack Cohen and I'm a Jew, and here is my type-in." So the acronym means you can't do business sitting on your arse. But of course, when Jack started mixing with royalty, I can't imagine that he would have said anything other than armchair instead of arse, except perhaps to Prince Philip. So how did I get involved with all of this? Yes, that's yours truly at my bar mitzvah at the Grosvenor Rooms in 1968. It was a little bit embarrassing at my bar mitzvah because my father had the unenviable task of phoning up his uncle to inquire as to why we never got a present, which of course I'm sure was an oversight. I ended up getting £150 in premium bonds, which in 1968 was a pretty generous present. So I did meet Jack on quite a few occasions, and I always found him very charming. So Jack was born in Ashfield Street in Whitechapel to a family like many of our grandparents who had immigrated from Russia, from the Pale of Settlement and Poland at the end of the 19th century. And his father was a very religious man, and he was a tailor, and he expected Jack to follow suit. My grandfather Morris was a loyal family member, and he did so, but Jack was a bit of a rebel. That was the school that he went to. I would like to think that he got his broken nose from getting into a fight with an anti-Semite, but I don't actually think that's the case. Then the family moved to Darnley Road in Hackney, and then on to Gore Road in Clapton, I believe, which is quite near Victoria Park, Gunton Road. And then the big jump, it's not Chessington Road, is it? It's Chessington Avenue. And this actually wasn't Jack's house. It's just an example of a house in Chessington Avenue. And if you go to Kinloss Shul, you'll see that there is a plaque there saying that Jack Cohen laid the foundation stone at the Shul. One little aside relating to the house in Chessington Avenue is that during World War II, Clementine Churchill visited the house and attended a charitable fundraising function to raise money for ambulances in Russia. Lady Clementine Churchill was a regular visitor to Russia, and it's nice to think that Jack Cohen played a small part in the war effort in World War II to that effect. And then that's Jack's final residence in Cumberland Terrace in Regent's Park. So from a barrow boy in Wells Street to Cumberland Terrace, I think is pretty admirable. So then going back to first beginnings again, as I said before, Jack was in the Royal Flying Corps from 1917 onwards. He saw service in France and in Egypt. He was actually on a ship in the harbour in Alexandria, which when it sank, he unfortunately couldn't swim, and he was saved by a nurse who kept him afloat for about 40 minutes. And he tried to track her down, but I don't think he ever saw her again. Let's admit Lawrence Davidson, shall we? Hope you can all hear me again now. So after the First World War, he was given demob money of £30, which is worth about £1,500 now, and he used that to set up a stall. He sold syrup and biscuits, all sorts of items from NAFI sales. And that's an example of a market that he would work in. You had to get the best pitch when you had to put up a market stall, and Jack was pretty agile, and he had the attribute of throwing his cap onto the spot where he wanted to set up his stall. So how did the name Tesco come about? And if I had £10 for every time somebody told me that it's a combination of his wife's name Tessa and the last two initials of his surname Cohen, I'd be quite a rich man. But Jack's wife was not called Tessa, as I've indicated earlier. She was Sarah Cohen, also known as Sissy Fox. And now Tesco was one of the first Tesco tea was one of the first items that he sold in a big way, and the tea company was called T.E. Stockdale. So it's the first three letters of the name Stockdale and the first two letters of the name Cohen, and that's how the name came about. There was a time actually after Jack had retired from Tesco when the company was thinking of changing its name because they thought that it was altogether too down market sounding. But somehow or another, that didn't happen. I don't know why monkeys were so much in demand those days for selling tea. Wasn't it PG Tips, Brook Bond's PG Tips? So Jack and Sissy married in 1924, and that's probably the occasion when they had their golden wedding, I believe. Jack's favourite restaurant in Whitechapel, not surprisingly, was Bloom's. He used to take his daughters up there most Sundays, and he was widely recognised. And I think, quite frankly, he enjoyed publicity and enjoyed meeting people and enjoyed it when they recognised him. Of course, Bloom's is now gone. Giles Coren made an amusing comment about Bloom's. There should be a shiver for Bloom's. We should put a plate of salt beef in a low chair. is going to be replaced by some god-awful Burger King, which it was. I'm an old Ashkenazi at heart. I don't like all that Israeli stuff. I'm suspicious of it. It's Arab food as far as I'm concerned. So when Jack started to open shops, the first of which was in Burnt Oak in Edgware, he also found himself some premises in Upper Clapton Road and started going into wholesale as well in parallel. So there's the first store. In fact, since I've first prepared this presentation, there are now more stores than that. It's 7,005 worldwide and 423,000 employees. There's an example of some of the lorries that he used when he went into wholesaling. I think that things have gone full circle now because Tesco have recently merged with the Booker Partnership, who are wholesalers. Jack started to show an interest in supermarkets as such in the early 30s and visited America. But I think he decided that however sparkling the supermarkets were there, that the UK wasn't quite ready for them. He's certainly no misogynist or anti-feminist because one of his principal employees from those early days was Daisy Hart, who became Daisy Hyams, his chief buyer. I don't think Margaret Thatcher had much on her. And even before World War II, Tesco had about 100 stores, and he was well enough established to go on a Mediterranean cruise. I think their last holiday, they came back from France on around the 31st of August 1939, not long before hostilities broke out. And in fact, when World War II did come about, Jack was very quick to bring in rationing points of his own in his shops and stores. And he was even recruited by the government to head a committee, a rationing committee. Here we are. The Food Trade Emergency Committee. That's just an example of some kind of diet during those years. So after the war, Tesco went public, was very much oversubscribed. Tesco was not particularly well disciplined in its management of accounts in the early years, but eventually Jack got himself accountants and solicitors, as you would have to in an expanding business like that. It was very much back of the envelope sort of trading in the early years. And then eventually he decided that he would experiment with supermarkets, the first one being in St Albans in Hertfordshire. The experiment was reasonably successful, but they actually suspended it until it came back permanently. Of course, expansion meant buying up other shops such as Bernard's and Williamson's, Victor Value, Price Right. Also expansion up in Scotland. And this is probably one of the ways in which Tesco ultimately overtook Sainsbury's as being the market leader in supermarkets. And then in Malden, Essex in 1958, that was the first supermarket. And in fact, Jack visited the first hypermarket in Pitsea near Basildon just before he died in about 1978. It's remarkable that he was able to live long enough to see the total transformation of Tesco. Green Shield stamps was a gimmick that actually brought Tesco a long way in the competition with Sainsbury's, because Sainsbury's didn't want to get involved with that kind of thing. It was a difficult decision to go into Green Shield stamps. There was competition from S&H stamps as well. But I think the idea was that the housewife thought she was getting something, a Kenwood mixer or something like that, without having to pay for it. And that was the popularity of it. When he opened the first few supermarkets, they tended to have multi-story car parks, as you can see here. But in recent years, customers have much preferred to shop where there's a ground floor car parks. So Sainsbury's rejected Green Shield stamps, but eventually, when Green Shield evolved into Argos in 1973, the irony is that Sainsbury's ended up buying it. And that was Green Shield's house in Edgware, which I think is now being completely knocked down and built again as flats or offices. Tesco expanded into other areas besides food. So home and wear, which has now changed to F&F, which was very much pioneered by Sir Leslie Porter, Jack's son-in-law. There he is. So when Jack retired as chairman of Tesco in 1970, he was succeeded by Hyman Kreitman from 1970 to 1973, and thereafter by Sir Leslie Porter. Tesco was always in the news in the 1960s, not just for Green Shield stamps, but because of the abolition of resale price maintenance. So Jack got to meet in their capacities of either president of the Board of Trade or even as Prime Minister. He met Edward Heath, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, and Harold Wilson. And eventually, after much publicity and through the newspapers, this impediment to free trade was removed because it was a way by which wholesalers could regulate the prices that the consumers would pay. And Jack perceived that he would be very much the consumer's friend if he could remove this impediment. And that's just an example of how it operated in relation to a Bex Bissell carpet sweeper. Of course, they branched into other areas for the benefit of consumers, and Tesco, one of the first supermarkets to pioneer the sale of petrol. And although Green Shield stamps were very successful at first, like everything else, they had a finite shelf life. And although Jack wanted to carry on, his successor, Ian Maclaurin, was very keen on replacing it with something else. His Operation Checkout was basically the idea of just reducing prices to compete with other supermarkets. And they changed from Green Shield stamps to this price reducing aspect over the Jubilee period, taking everyone by surprise. That was their headquarters in Chessington, a very unprepossessing looking building on an even more unprepossessing road, Delamere Road, which became a Tesco brand name. They moved up the A10 from Clacton to Edmonton to Chessington, and now they got really very sparkling, huge office complex at Welwyn Garden City. So Ian Maclaurin, he was very different from the rest of the Tesco family. He wasn't Jewish for a start, and he came from an upper middle class family in Blackheath in Kent. His mother was disgusted when he said he wanted to go and work for Tesco. I think it was the fact that Tesco were considered well, it was trade, wasn't it? He went to university, he was expected to go into a profession. So first of all, he went into trade, and then he went into a company that was really at the bottom end of the market. And I suppose, thirdly, the unspoken aspect of her disgust was that he was working for a Jew, quite frankly. But I think it served him pretty well, Sir Ian Maclaurin, and he's got some nice stories to tell about Jack Cohen. In fact, if you visit the British Library on their website, they have oral histories, and they've got hours of interviews with Sir Ian Maclaurin and Terry Lee and Dave Lewis, Shirley Porter, and employees of Tesco where you can really get a good flavour of the whole story of how Tesco came about and how it. That's the Pitsea store. That was the last store that Jack visited. And yes, so he was knighted in 1969. Yes, he lived to about 1978, and he was knighted then. I don't know very much about worshipful companies, but this was one that he belonged to. He was a Freemason as well. Now, I haven't read many Geoffrey Archer novels, but I'm told that that market stall there represents a certain Charlie Trumper that's loosely based upon Jack Cohen. If anyone's read the novel, I'd be very interested to hear if it really does have some relationship to Jack Cohen's start in life. There's a blue plaque to him. 1979 he died, not 1978. So in this book, it was written about him by Maurice Corona. He gives Jack the opportunity to reflect upon his life. And the lessons I learned in the early days still apply. A company that works hard and insists upon offering value for money, is not afraid to experiment, and will make changes, will always prosper. He's buried at Willesden Cemetery, which is now an English heritage site. My story has been a dream, and I want to tell it for the sake of younger people who may wonder whether some of the things that I've been able to accomplish in my lifetime can really be done. If it encourages others to try harder against the odds, that will please me. So after Sir Ian Maclaurin, Terry Lee brought in his own ideas, one of which is Club Card, which I think has done an enormous amount to propel Tesco to have now nearly 28% of the market share, because it gives them a great idea as to what people's spending habits are and what sort of items that they buy in Tesco. Sainsbury's very much turned their noses up at Club Card, but of course they brought in their own loyalty card. So that's the second time that Sainsbury's have been behind the curve, as it were. So Sainsbury's fell behind, and they have never recovered since. There are plenty of competitors, of course, now, such as Asda and the German companies Lidl and Aldi, but Tesco is still market leader. So Tesco is no longer considered to be at the bottom end of the market, although, as you can see behind Terry Lee, it has these ranges: Tesco Value, which are basic items that are reasonably priced, and there is also Tesco Quality items, which compete with Marks and Spencer's. Tesco Finest, they're called. All different types. Tesco comes in all different shapes and sizes now. Tesco Express, Tesco Metro, Superstore, Tesco Extra and One Stop. I'm discovering new companies that were taken over by Tesco, the cafe restaurant Giraffe, for example. Tesco's been very good for actors such as Dudley Moore, hasn't done them any harm with their advertising, and Prunella Scales as well. And of course, in common with so many other stores now, they have had to become sponsors of various charities, one of which is cancer research. And here's some basic facts about Tesco. I think it's fair to say that Sunday trading helped them very much, and their ability to get prime locations, out of town locations as well. So it's the third largest retailer in the world, measured by gross revenues. It has pulled out of some of the the Far East companies now, such as Thailand, and also some of the European countries, but it's consolidated its position in the UK. It did try to penetrate the American market with its fresh and easy stores in California, but it's a very, very difficult market to conquer, and they pulled out of that as well eventually. Gone into banking as well and telephones now. Of course, not everybody thinks Tesco is wonderful, and there's a critical book which has got a couple of devil's horns above the O in Tescopoly. And there's the traditional plutocrat from Monopoly. Maybe I'm oversensitive, but sometimes I think the amount of criticism that Tesco gets is still tinged with a little bit of anti-Semitism as to its provenance, but maybe that's just me. Here they are playing Monopoly. Can you recognize Robert Morley and Sir James Gulliver? This was a game that was played on TV, and Jack actually won. So there you are, the winner takes all. Of course, they did have a very bad year after Terry Lee retired and Philip Clark became the chairman, the chief executive, when they understated profits by more than 250 million. The shares took a very bad hit, and as did Tesco's reputation, a lot more than the minor kerfuffle over selling horse meat in what was supposed to be beef burgers. Consequences still reverberate, but after Philip Clark resigned, they did very well to get Dave Lewis to turn around the company and restore its fortunes. I think he deserved his payoff. One of the ideas of Dave Lewis was to open a rival to Aldi and Lidl, the first one of which, called Jack's, of course, which is named after Jack Cohen, was in Chatteris near Cambridge, and they've got a nice little poster about Jack as you go in. Also with the emphasis upon what Jack always used to say the housewife wanted most, that's value for money. But it's nice that when Dave Lewis retired, he paid tribute to the spirit of Jack Cohen, as you can see from the photographs that we've previously seen. It's nice that the present management, completely divorced as it is from the Cohen family, still recognize that without Jack's energy, drive, ambition, and constant nagging, they wouldn't be where they were today. And this is the new chief executive, Ken Murphy. Just a little bit of reflective philosophy before I close. I do have this very deep feeling within myself, Jack said, that while I'm British, I'm also Jewish by birth and conviction. But my feeling is not confined to just one part of the Middle East. If only we could share it, we're all akin, there would be peace. Jack was very loyal to his Jewish ancestry and origins. I wouldn't say that he was a religious Jew by a long stroke. In fact, he fell out with his father over religious observance. And my father told a story that when he started working in the markets on Saturdays, he not only, his vocabulary became somewhat coarse, but he took on some of the habits as well after First World War, when he was mixing with a lot of non-Jewish people. He developed a liking for bacon, and his father cursed him and said that, may you choke on the first bit of bacon that you eat. So ever after that, if Jack had bacon on his plate, he would always cut the first piece away. I would like to see Israel survive because it is so necessary for the world to have countries like this. What has been done is really a miracle. As a Roman Catholic looks towards Rome, I regard Israel as my spiritual home. Would Tesco under Jack label products as coming from the West Bank or even Palestine rather than Israel? I think not. I don't think Jack would have tolerated any kind of boycott at all of goods from any part of Israel. And this was his daughter, Linda. She wrote a little poem. So there is a link to the British Library's website containing all those fascinating oral histories. And there is my email if anybody wants to ask me further questions, I should be happy to answer them. Now, I've just about done 40 minutes. I don't want to eat into any further time because I'd like to hear some anecdotes and answer some questions. Thank you very much for hearing me, and I look forward to everyone switching on their microphones now so we can have a chat.
Right, if
I've allowed people to unmute.
I had one dealing with Leslie Porter, actually, rather than with Jack Cohen himself. Yeah. I used to work for a shopping company developer called Arndale. Their first shopping centre, indoor shopping centre that they built in London was in Wandsworth, which is obviously near to Wimbledon. I was told at the time that that was their first home and wear department, where they put the home and wear. It was, as Richard said, Leslie Porter's idea to put the home and wear up on the first floor and the supermarket on the ground floor. And we used to work very closely with a man, very able architect called Francis Kreiger.
Yes, he features in the books, yeah.
Yes, who was an in-house architect. And Jack Cohen was very loyal to him. I think he used him for all his supermarket design over a number of years. But you said the home and wear actually started in about 1960.
Yes, that's when it started. Yes, when Leslie Porter came on board, and I think they now call their clothing F&F, Florence and Freddie, something like that. But yes, I mean, in a lot of their stores now, there's quite a big section that's given over to the sale of clothing. Yes, indeed, that's true. Jack actually didn't get on particularly well with Hyman and Leslie Porter. I mean, Hyman was a very cultivated man, and he and his wife Irene Kreitman, they were sponsors of the arts. If you read the obituary of Irene in particular, she was involved with the Tate Gallery. In fact, she used to be a tour guide, very different to Sir Leslie and Shirley Porter. And I think it's fair to say that Hyman's short reign from 1970 to 1973, I think Jack almost drove him to nearly having a breakdown, because Jack was a terrible nagger, apparently, which you probably have to be if the buck stops with you as the chairman of an organisation. I think he met his match in Sir Leslie Porter, and there's a story which I'm told is not apocryphal, but Wilkinson Sword provided them with a couple of swords for the company director's office. And one day Jack and Leslie were having such a bad argument that they actually both pulled the swords down from the wall, and they went at each other with these swords. And there's other legendary stories about them having really bad arguments in a car going to meetings and so on and so forth. But I suppose, to be creative, sometimes sparks have to fly. And I think what is undeniable that Jack was a character, and he inspired a huge amount of loyalty from his customers and from his staff as well.
And can you say something about Shirley Porter? Because she was quite a controversial.
Well, she was indeed. I mean, if you think Jack was a nagger, it certainly rubbed off on Shirley Porter, because I think, if you examine her reign when she was the leader of Westminster Council with her litter campaigns and so on and so forth, I think she was a bit of a Jewish Margaret Thatcher, I would say. Very determined lady. I mean, she did a lot to remove the bar from Jewish people playing golf at clubs in Finchley and in the area where she lived. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in those days. And she's a very able lady, and her and Sir Leslie, they've sponsored universities in Israel and various charities. But unfortunately, I don't really need to tell you that she did get a bad name for her and the Cohen family over the question of the alleged gerrymandering in the city of Westminster. So she's had to keep a low profile. But as I indicated earlier, even before these scandals, Ian Maclaurin made it his business that she would not be on the board after Leslie and Hyman had departed from the scene. I mean, certainly Irene Crichton wouldn't have wanted to be on the board. So yes, it's a bit of a checkered story about Shirley, but I think you have to look at her career as a whole and not just upon some of them. You have to judge somebody not just by the things they do that are not good, but some of the things they do that are good as well. I mean, I give talks about Winston Churchill, and people are commonly reminding me of some of the things that he did that were wrong. So we all do good things and bad things, and perhaps we've been over harsh with Shirley, and in the fullness of time, we'll have a more rounded picture about her.
Any questions from the audience?
Make a couple of comments.
Yes.
I have some reminiscences of Jack Cohen personally. I was the president of the British Independent Grocers Association when Sir John was in his autumn years. And when he got the knighthood, this is a well-known fact, he was asked why he had changed his name from Jack to Sir John. And in fact, the bust of him at the Chessington head office was of Sir John Cohen. And he said, with a name like Sir John, I cannot sell broken biscuits and dented cans anymore. He called me the young man at Whiteley's. Whiteley's of Queensway. I was the group food controller of United Drapery stores. And we were once having a meeting at the Chessington head office, and we'd had lunch in the canteen. And Sir John said to me, young man, what did you have for lunch? And I said, best fillet steak, Sir John, out of the stores. And he turned to Davies Hyams and said, I never got any fillet steak for lunch. Oh. He was very quick on repartee, and why people resented him is not only because he was Jewish, but with many Jewish entrepreneurs, there is this phenomenal energy. They never stop working. Working is a lifestyle. When Shirley was a little girl, her idea of a Sunday afternoon treat was being taken by Jack on a Green Line bus ride. And he would take note of all the vacant stores on every corner. And first thing on Monday morning, he would ring the local authorities to find out the beneficial owner, and by Monday afternoon, put in a bid. So he had the selection of the best sites in the 30s. The corner, of course, meant that you could have parking on two fronts. And that, of course, was a tremendous boon. Now, Richard touched upon Lidl and Aldi. Lidl and Aldi have not done anything new. They did everything that Sir John did in the 1930s to get around resale price maintenance and continue that after World War II, because it was a legacy of the World War II legislation that resale price maintenance should be kept in force so that people could buy all the basic commodities at the same price. It was to stop the black market. What Sir John did was that he pioneered own label branding, buying goods from secondary manufacturers, just as good as primary ones, with the unique Tesco label on them, so he could legitimately underprice resale price maintenance. He was, in many ways, a retail scientist. And Ian McLaurin, who was his first trainee, who came from a co-op in South Wales, carried on that philosophy, that retail is detail. And Sir Ian McLaurin was notorious for going around stores, picking up pieces of paper from the floor. He wanted everything absolutely tickety-boo. And those feelings, those approaches came from Sir John. He was years before his time. Oh, by the way, the last store he visited was Brent Cross. He was there at the opening of Brent Cross.
Really?
Weeks of Brent Cross opening, he'd expired. In fact, he sat in the management office at Brent Cross with tears trickling down his face because he could remember vividly, quite obviously, the barrow that he had in Mare Street, Hackney. And all this had happened in his lifetime. It was at the time the largest hypermarket in the UK, Brent Cross.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you for that. I mean, that was really excellent what you had to say, Barry. And perhaps I'd like to recruit you to share these talks with me, because I think, you know, it was so wonderful what you had to say. But
you haven't heard my fee.
Ian McLaurin insists that the final store that he visited was Pitsy in Basildon. So it's Barry Epstein versus Ian McLaurin.
We're both into cricket, so it's all right.
Yeah, okay. Now, how about Basil?
David, David Cohen, yeah.
Can I just pick up on what Barry said about, that was saying about the private label manufacturer? In fact, we milled Tesco flour. We were Friendlight flour, and we did all the milling. And we had the, what shall I use the word, privilege, misfortune, or whatever it is, of dealing regularly with Daisy Hyams.
You survived. And you survived.
There was only one, it was quite unique, actually. The only way that you could be a supplier to Tesco at that scale was to insist that, okay, if there was 60% Tesco, you had to have 40% of your own brand, because the own label was done purely at cost, and she monitored it. So it wasn't an easy ride, and she was no easy person to deal with. The other thing that I think that I'd like to make the comment on is the fact that, of course, Green Shield stamps was a savior for Tesco. There was a tremendous rivalry between them and Victor Value. And Victor Value was winning the game. But then they both got into trouble, and Jack chose green and they chose pink. The week that he actually started with green, which saved him, their turnover went up by 30% on that week. And that saved them. And that's why they bought Victor Value, because at one time Victor Value was going to buy them. It was that bad.
May I make a statement, please? Good evening.
Yes.
Hello, Mr. Mann.
My name's Basil Mann. My late father was selling caps opposite Jack's in Mare Street or Wells Street, wherever it was. And the story goes that eventually they met each other after about 50 years and they hugged each other. They were so pleased to see. My father always talked about that. They were so pleased to meet each other. My father had similar ideas to Jack, but nowhere near as large. But it was something that I always remembered him talking, and that's why I wanted to listen and be online this evening.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, I've chaired the Jewish Historical Society branch, and I always maintain that the best history is oral history. And I think it's really nice that you're recording this so that, you know, all the comments that people have can be kept for posterity. It's wonderful.
He was also a season ticket holder of Tottenham, I believe, at one time.
Yes, and that's extended down the family. Not that we get much nachas out of them, or any nachas out of them at all. I was keen on horses, as you saw. There was a horse called Tesco Boy, which did pretty well for a time. I think that was one of the earlier photographs that I showed. He liked South Africa very much as a venue to. I think he used to winter there, but he was very attached to Israel as well.
Yeah. I remember him being on the JIA food trade chat at one time.
Yeah.
Very big. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience. I hope I haven't bored you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
The recent series Ridley Road, I don't know whether you watched it.
Oh, yes, it mentioned Jack Cohen.
They mentioned Jack. Do you think that's, how prevalent was that, the fear of Tesco and it having a Jewish owner who was running the world in some way?
Well, when you analyse it, he used his DMOB money to set up a stall and, you know, make a profit and to work all the hours that God gave him. So it's nothing to do with the Jewish conspiracy, is it? It's just that, as somebody pointed out earlier, he had a very strong work ethic. And this ethic we see now amongst the Indian population with their corner shops and so on. It was a crazy notion, the idea that there was some kind of Jewish conspiracy to take over the country. It's just that he succeeded by dint of his disciplined efforts. Whereas I'm sure plenty of other people just use the DMOB money without investing it. He was just careful the way that he invested his money, and he had an idea as to where he wanted to be. So he knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get it. And you know that's why he succeeded. The thing about Ridley Road is that even that lady who started off as being pretty anti-Semitic, you know, the landlady to the heroine of the program, she changed her views, didn't she, at the end? Because there's so much proper. There's so
how prevalent it was. That was all these attitudes.
It's prejudice, isn't it? I mean, even now, if you Google why do I hate Tesco, I think someone comes up and says because of Shirley Porter. You know, I mean, the Cohen family has nothing to do with Tesco at all anymore. It's you know, it's just these prejudices, they just die so hard. And of course, you know, what's going on in Israel now just kind of reinforces it, unfortunately.
Richard, that was something I wanted to ask you. Obviously, your great uncle was an emotional man.
Yes.
And I wondered, what do you think he would feel that this great empire that he created is no longer connected with his family, that no members of the family are connected with this empire?
I think he would feel a little bit sad, to be honest, but at the same time, I think he'd be fiercely proud that it's the market leader by a very long way. And as Ian McLaurin points out in his autobiography, it could easily have gone the other way. There are many occasions when Tesco could have almost gone under because some of its practices when they first started out are hair-raising. I mean, they used to put food in the lavatory to keep it cool, milk. I mean, it was so prehistoric, some of the way that things were dealt with, and the way they treated employees and so on and so forth. I mean, they really have come a long way. So whilst it could never have started without Jack's drive and ambition, you know, he did need people that were experts in their particular area to take the torch forward. I just want to show you a couple of books about Tesco. This one is very good, by David Powell. All of them you can get on Amazon. And there's something on by somebody called Sarah Ryle, who actually worked for Tesco for a long time, and she wrote a very comprehensive book about Tesco up to about 2012. So she missed the most recent scandal that's hit Tesco, but that's very much worth reading. And this book now by Maurice Caruno is very out of date. Pile it high, sell it cheap. It's very out of date. So maybe one of these days I should get together with Mr. Epstein and work on an updated biography.
Sheila, can I call on you to say a few words to Richard?
Absolutely. Richard, thank you very much indeed. You've entered quite a few homes of Jewish folk south of the river, and we have thoroughly enjoyed your rich stories. I don't think any of us will now enter Tesco without remembering something you have told us. I have to say, I'm one of those that did think Tesco was named after Tessie, but I'll know better next time I step foot. Thank you so much for entertaining us so nicely, and hopefully we'll have you back again sometime soon.
It's been an absolute pleasure. My other two talks are about Winston Churchill and the Jews, and I'm also pretty well prepared one on the Balfour Declaration. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's all right. Can I ask everybody to please say thank you in the usual manner?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I just mention a couple of events that we've got coming up? As most of certainly Wimbledon members will know, we've got a rehearsed reading of The Winslow Boy, which is quite exciting, on the 21st of November. This will be the second of the plays that we'll have held in the synagogue with a large cast, mostly Wimbledon members. And then our last event of the year is in December on vaccines, plagues and Jews, which will be another Zoom evening. And we have our series of Getting to Know Yous coming up. We've got Diane Barnett on the 16th of November, Tony Salem on the 30th, and Anton Fishman on the 14th. So that will take care of us until the end of 2021. And we're already working on quite a big program for ourselves for next year. So if I can add my thanks to you, Richard, for spending the time with us this evening. And we look forward to inviting you to talk to us about Winston Churchill, who's a particular interest of mine, and the Balfour Declaration, maybe sometime next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. From Manchester, thank you very much. It was really interesting. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Good night. Bye.
Good night. Thank you very
Good night.
much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm going to close down. Thank you.
Okay. Thank